Hello, I'm David Hardesty. In this lecture, we introduce the topic of transfer pricing as it relates to electronic commerce. The objectives of this lecture are as follows: to understand the basic concepts of transfer pricing, understand the different methods for determining transfer pricing of tangible property, understand the different methods of determining the transfer prices of intangibles, and learn the basic concepts behind a functional analysis of electronic commerce activities. Here is the basic rule for transfer pricing in the United States. In the United States, the basic rule for transfer pricing is set out in Section 482. This section provides as follows. In any case of two or more organizations, trades, or businesses, whether or not incorporated, and whether or not organized in the United States, and whether or not affiliated, but which are owned or controlled directly or indirectly by the same interests. The IRS may distribute, apportion, or allocate income, deductions, credits, or allowances between or among the organizations, trades, or businesses. If the IRS determines that such distribution, apportionment, or allocation is necessary in order to prevent evasion of taxes or clearly to reflect the income of any such organizations, trades, or businesses. In the case of any transfer or license of intangible property within the meaning of Section 936H3B, the income with respect to such transfer or license must be commensurate with the income attributable to the intangible. Now, because in a transfer pricing situation we are ordinarily dealing with another country, which may also have authority over the taxpayer, we need to acknowledge foreign transfer pricing rules. The foreign transfer pricing rules we are mostly concerned with are the rules of the OECD, that is, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development.
The OECD is an organization composed of most of the world's developed countries and works to set worldwide trade standards, including tax rules that all countries can agree upon. We will not be studying the OECD transfer pricing standards in this lecture. Suffice it to say that the standards are similar to the US standards, but they are not the same. Going back to Section 482, the key to avoid an IRS adjustment is to price transactions between controlled companies using an arm's length price. The arm's length standard is accepted around the world as the method for testing transfer prices between controlled companies. In general,
an arm's length price is the price that would be charged between two independent enterprises in a comparable transaction. For example, assume US Co. holds a patent on certain technology which can be incorporated into software used to provide online services. It licenses that patent to unrelated company X for a royalty of 5% of the revenue from online services that incorporates that technology. Now, assume that US Co. forms a subsidiary corporation, Company Y, to operate an online service that incorporates the same technology. It licenses the patent to Company Y on exactly the same terms as it licensed the technology to Company X. If US Co. can prove that the transaction with Company X, the unrelated company, and Company Y, a controlled company, are comparable, and that the terms of the license are the same, then the IRS is unlikely to adjust the price charged to the subsidiary. In this example, although they seem comparable on the surface, as we will see in the text, there are a number of factors necessary to prove comparability. So, if transfers between controlled companies must be arm's length, how do we determine an arm's length price? As it turns out, there are three sets of pricing methods under U.S. tax law. The OECD adds more pricing methods, which we will not discuss here. The first set of pricing methods is for transfers of tangible property, such as transfers of inventory. The second set of pricing methods is for intangible property, such as patents and copyrights. And the third set of pricing methods is for services. All of these methods are discussed in the text, and we will not go into them here. What we want to do here is discuss the basic methodology for testing transactions using specific pricing methods. In order to understand how to test a transfer price, we're going to use a simple example. In this example, Clothing Inc. is a U.S. retailer of clothing. Clothing Inc. forms Clothing.com, a Cayman Islands corporation, which will sell clothing to customers from its website. Products sold by Clothing.com are shipped directly to customers from Clothing Inc.'s inventory. Clothing Inc. bills Clothing.com for clothing sold. The question is, how should Clothing Inc. determine how much to bill Clothing.com? Here are the requirements for determining the price between the two companies. First, the price must be an arm's length price. So even though Clothing Inc. completely controls Clothing.com, we must determine a price as if Clothing.com was an unrelated third party. To be arm's length, the price must be a comparable, uncontrolled price, meaning it must equal a price that would be charged in a comparable situation with an unrelated company. What does comparable mean? As it turns out, this is the most important question in transfer pricing. Why is this the most important question? Because transfer prices are ordinarily tested by comparing them to prices charged in uncontrolled transactions, that is, transactions between unrelated companies. However, prices obtained from transactions that are not comparable to the one tested cannot be used to test a controlled transaction. Here's what I mean by this. Assume in this example that we choose to price the transaction between Clothing Inc. and Clothing.com using a price that Clothing Inc. would charge an unrelated company. For instance, Clothing Inc. might charge a wholesale price for the clothing to an unrelated reseller. However, charging this wholesale price to Clothing.com assumes that Clothing.com operates as a full-function online retailer. As we will see in the next set of slides, it is unlikely that Clothing.com performs all of the functions of an online retailer, so pricing the transaction based on sales to an unrelated retailer is probably not going to result in an arm's length price. To test an uncontrolled transaction for comparability, we first must perform a functional analysis of the parties involved in order to know what kind of transaction we're dealing with.
In the text, there is an example of a functional analysis involving an online retailer, Clothing.com. In the table in the text, we see that the only function performed by Clothing.com is the operation of a web server from which sales are made.
Notice the key functions Clothing.com does not perform. It does not perform marketing or advertising functions. It does not manage inventory. It does not own or use any marketing intangibles. And it does not assume any of the risks traditionally assumed by retailers, such as the risk of holding inventory or credit risk.
Based on this analysis, Clothing.com is not a full retailer. Instead, Clothing.com merely provides Clothing Inc. with a web server. That is, Clothing.com is not a retailer, it is a service provider.
Now that we know what kind of transaction we are dealing with, we can choose the correct pricing methods to test the pricing between Clothing Inc. and Clothing.com. As noted in the previous slide, Clothing.com provides a service to Clothing Inc. We can call this service an e-commerce service provider. To price this service, we would go to the regulations for services between controlled companies. Under these regulations, We can start with the comparable uncontrolled services price method discussed in the text at 13a.021ci. Under this method, we would find out what an unrelated company would charge Clothing Inc. to perform the same functions as Clothing.com. If we can find such a price, then that is the one we will use to price the transactions, and we would account for the transaction as a payment by Clothing Inc. for services, not a sale of inventory to Clothing.com. Whether or not we find a comparable uncontrolled services price, we must also try the other pricing methods discussed in the text for services until we find one that matches the comparability requirements. It is likely that more than one pricing method can be used to price this service. What method would we use? As discussed in the text at 13a.012b, once we have assembled all of our pricing, we must select the pricing method that results in the best price. The best method is the pricing method that gives us the most reliable measure of an arm's length price.